Welcome, everyone. This is the premiere episode of the all new podcast, A Storyteller's Power Hour. I am your host, Jen, and I will hopefully be your host throughout the rest of this podcast. Let's hope so. I will be joined occasionally by some guests. I have a couple of people in mind to talk about very specific subjects. And for tonight, we are going to talk about the coming topics. What is a storyteller's power hour about? How are we going to present information? What kinds of things, not just will we be talking about, but what kinds of things maybe we won't be talking about by exclusion? And maybe you'll find something that you'll enjoy here. Grab a cup of tea, grab your favorite fuzzy blanket, and let's just have a chat about story. This entire podcast idea has been born over a really long period of time for me. Just by way of sort of quick introduction, my name is Jen. I live on the island of Maui in Hawaii. I have been a storyteller in one type or other since I have been about 5 years old. I remember writing my first story and being so excited about it. It was a king who went to the moon and forgot his spaceship on the other side of the moon and had to have a long rope lowered down to earth to I didn't say it was good. I just said it was a story. But my fascination with story really has been a lifelong engagement. Um, when I was in about third grade, I read The Hobbit. It was part of when kids read at a certain level, they introduce them to fiction that's maybe a little bit above where they are, where the rest of their classmates are. I fell in love with Tolkien. Um, and I think the reason that I fell in love with Tolkien, not just because, there was something fantasy and amazing going on, was because Tolkien's love of language shone absolutely through. Everything that Tolkien did, in my estimation, in The Hobbit, when I was reading it when I was younger, was like a hook in and of itself. There was alliteration, there were extended metaphors, there were all kinds of interesting turns of phrase. There were descriptions that I had never even thought or imagined before. It was just absolutely overwhelming. And as I grew, my love of Tolkien continued to grow, but more importantly, I think my love of story really continued to flourish. When I got into high school, I had already taken a ton of creative writing classes. I had been involved in all kinds of different publishing endeavors and, youth in media and all kinds of things. But someone introduced me to a book by Joseph Campbell. And before I sort of get into that piece, I just want to sort of set a little bit of a record kind of straight here about how I feel about this. Um, Joseph Campbell has been a real ideological pillar for me. I absolutely understand on a granular level what it is that he said and sort of was trying to convey about art as a mechanism for civilization, humankind, to convey the important ideas that perhaps conceptually we don't have language for. And so sometimes we use art as a way to convey it. And that can be through metaphor. It can also be through paintings and through sculpture and through music. It can be through all kinds of different art forms. Um, I recognize that Joseph Campbell has some problematic ideas, and some of the things that he espouses are not perfect. And we'll try to get into that as much as possible because I think it's important to look at things kind of head on rather than skirt around them. So, having said that, Lots of Joseph Campbell is a part of how I understand, view, dissect, and then reinterpret what the storyteller's power really is. It is definitely foundational for me. But there's a lot of other very important ideas in storytelling which I have clung to and really gotten a lot out of. Um, when I was in college, I started to study this system of storytelling called Dramatica. And at the time, it was just absolutely amazing. It was the most structured system of storytelling I had ever encountered. And in some ways, when you talk about freedom through structure, that's exactly what I saw. Plugging in all of these different ideas almost writes the story for you. Not quite, but it kind of filled in a lot of the gaps that I always felt that some stories were missing. And here's why. They didn't have this plane of storytelling completely filled in. There wasn't a psychological aspect, there wasn't a physical realm aspect, or whatever it was. And so I grew from that too. As I got into college, I went to school for filmmaking. And at that point, I think that's when I sort of understood that all my years of photography, all my years of being in cinema, in all of my younger years, really kind of gave me this feeling of, okay, this is where it all culminates. This is where the storytelling begins and has fruition. And unfortunately, I did not stay with that. I ended up having kids, and my life kind of took a different turn. But my love for story, my passion for continuing to write, I wrote romance novels. I have had a long run and a long fascination with story. It's never wavered. I've always been intensely interested in this. I've made friends that are in the quote unquote industry, industry in publishing, industry in filmmaking, industry in television, industry. And then in my later life, I've had lots of other, let's just say by association, lots of things have sort of come my way that have helped me to fulfill my professional love of storytelling. Um, and this is a huge thing for me. So, as I'm talking about my topics and the topics that I'd like to introduce you all to, just realize that this is where it was all born from. Also, as any good storyteller knows, the story is not about myself, the story is about the story itself. So, I don't want to spend a ton of time on that, but I just wanted you to know that this is where I come from. I absolutely passionately feel strongly that story, whether it's great story, whether it's just good story, whether it's just fair story, which is all entirely subjective because art and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Um, all of this stuff manifests from who we are and where we are. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. So one of the first episodes that I'm going to do, in fact, next week, is to introduce everyone to something I'm sure that they already know. But I feel like it's important to go over what the hero's journey is and what the hero's journey isn't. Because I feel like we've had a lot of confusion about the hero's journey, that it's somehow a templated version of story. It isn't, that it somehow creates a rigid structure by which you can't escape. That's not true. And that somehow having the hero's journey at the center of a story makes it with like there's a lot less options attached to it. That also isn't true. I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas behind the hero's journey, and I'd really like to explore how Joseph Campbell came up with this idea in the first place and why it even matters. Because for the most part, a lot of other storytelling experiences don't seem to hit us as hard as the hero's journey, either for the positive or for the negative. People really rally against it, or they're really for it, or it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people kind of in between. So we'll definitely be talking about that. Um, in the next episode, we're going to talk about children's books. Now, this one may end up spawning some other episodic pieces because children's books is impossible to talk about in one episode. But for our first episode, as an introduction to children's books, I really want to talk about the language that we're using with children. And it matters. We use rhyming schemes for a reason. We use illustrations that have certain characteristics in them for a reason. And y- I feel like at this point in our history, we are really paying a lot of attention to children's books, especially with all of the book banning that's going on. And I'm sure you don't have to think twice even about what my stance on that is. It's not good. I obviously don't feel like we should be banning books. Children's books in particular, I feel like we as adults have a really strong responsibility to protect and be the guardians of. But for the first episode, what I want to talk about is how books play, what part books play in understanding how we continue to perpetuate story. That is, how kids will listen to story and then begin to craft their own. And why does that matter? What does this actually that have that skill, how does it help our children? So, and I know that, again, I know that that's a huge topic. Let's face it, LeVar Burton did episodic runs of many different children's books, and each one he treated with honor, each one he gave a kind of reverence to. There is something special about honoring that particular genre of storytelling. So that's episode 2. Episode 3 for us is going to be The Damsel in Distress. Now this one is a little bit topically difficult because the damsel in distress has become almost what I think a lot of people consider to be the opposite of feminism. And that's not actually true. The opposite of feminism is not this. But where did we even come up with this, idea of the damsel in distress? And yes, a lot of it is based in the patriarchy, but what else? What more do we have? And I think I have some interesting ideas to sort of generate some conversation around why we still use this as a storytelling medium and why it's still an important part of our storytelling medium, and also how it's changing, which is also kind of exciting. Let's see. So our next episode is going to be about Greek myths and storytelling. This one I know will spawn many other podcast episodes. Storytelling in Greek mythology was the methodology, right? The Greek myths existed as stories to be told and passed down from generation to generation. It like Christianity, the Greek myths did not exist without the main central story. Um, and there are a lot of ways that we have now incorporated the power of the Greek myth and really come up with subgenres of storytelling that focus specifically on Prometheus, that focus on Narcissus, that focus on Zeus, that focus on all of the Greek pantheon. And what does that? Why is that even important in our own storytelling? We so much of our storytelling in the West is based off of these Greek myths, and by extension, then a lot of our storytelling is tragedy centered. So that, to me, that actually is a very interesting aspect. Um, our next episode is going to be about story as an arc or an extension of religion. So, real similar to what I was talking about with Greek myth, but we'll open it up and we'll talk about what are parables and how do myth and explanations of God make their way into our stories, and then how do those stories become maybe canonized. There's some really interesting ideas lately about how the Egyptians did it. And why, even though the Egyptian peasantry, obviously, were by and large illiterate, how they identified all of their symbols around them and understood these huge stories, the stories of Osiris, the stories that, talk about not just the underworld, but talk about the absolute, again, huge pantheon of gods. Um, and then there's all of the religions that exist around the world today. So that might be a couple of episodes. But for now, we'll start talking about what the parables and myths really are. And hopefully, we'll get to factor in a bit of Joseph Campbell into those particular pieces, because he had some really awesome ideas about the power of religion, in terms of it being the symbol, through storytelling. So I'm hoping that that can be something interesting for us all to explore. Um, in our next episode, we're going to sort of take a little bit of a break from the more conceptual and talk about a book series that personally I fell in love with. But it's not Tolkien, so don't worry, I won't nerd you to death. But I may, but I may use a lot of comparisons. This particular book series is called A Crown of Stars. It was written by Kate Elliott, and it is absolutely one of my most favorite series. It's hard for me to even understand how it hasn't been optioned as a movie, um, as a series. It has the breadth of so many worlds, and it incorporates so much of what I just talked about: the hero's journey, the myth, the idea of story arc as an extension of religion, the damsel in distress and what that really means. It just absolutely encapsulates all of those things, and it's a fabulous story, truly fabulous. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk a little bit about why Kate Elliott's series punctuates, I think, where storytelling has begun to pivot. Because this series was a bit, it was actually produced and written in the early 2000s up until like the mid 2000s, and it's fabulous. But we started to pivot after that, especially in fantasy-esque writing, in a very different direction. And I feel like her series is a great place to sort of like look at what came before and then what came after. So we'll have those conversations, and hopefully that we'll have a couple of guests on to have those conversations too. Um, in our next episode, we have, okay, this one is a little bit more intense, and I think kind of begins to move in the direction where I hope that Storyteller Power Hour will go. Writing story as history, dangers and advantages. We all know that the victor writes the history, or victory is the history that most people will remember. And so oftentimes we assign a type of morality based on the historical victor. The tales of how the victory was accomplished are often y- really, I don't, well, maybe embellished isn't a great word, but fluffed on all sides by stories of great deeds. And I think, if we look at something that's happening today in Ukraine, when we see and we hear the stories of what's happening there, we are witnessing history as a story unfolding in front of us. Now, I know it's deadly. There's a serious consequence to all of this. But I think it's important for us to recognize that when we begin to tell the stories of what happened here, why we need to carefully assess how we are telling some of these stories and who the victims are, who the heroes are, and, some of those things. I would really like to talk a little bit about how we have created a whole subgenre of literature that is based off of if the South had won the Civil War. Why is that a thing that we want to pay attention to? Why do we do that with World War II? I've known a ton of really interesting literature that has been written about, okay, well, what if things hadn't been the same? What if World War II had gone in a completely different direction? And I think the answer might be a little bit surprising about why it is that we feel that strong pull to both pay attention to those stories and to write those stories. And so I would really love to get into that. That's definitely a big one. And then as we sort of move forward into our podcast, Storyteller Power Hour series, we'll be talking a little bit more drill down specific on different types of both literature that we all love and how to maybe craft stories that pay attention to some of the more interesting literary ideas. I have a lot of friends right now, a lot, who are very interested in writing fan fiction. And I think that fan fiction has there's a great premise to this, which is to build off of something that has already been established and give it your own twist. So, I see this almost as if, you're in the kitchen and you're baking and you're making substitutions and you have to kind of experiment a little. Sometimes people like a little bit more of this spice, sometimes people like a little bit more of this. In the end, again, it's a subjective art, but I think we can agree that, there are some things that go into making a good story that sometimes live in fan fiction simply because the fiction that it came from was really good. So, what if we are going to break some of those things down? What are the interesting aspects to that? Um, on top of that, just as a kind of a quick side note, the one thing that I find the most fascinating about all the writers that I know is that they all have exceptional ideas. Even if their ideas seem like they've been told before, they're coming from an individual who has their own life experiences, who has their own individual understanding of, let's say, the morality of a situation, of the intricate history that may have gone into it. People have all different degrees and levels of understanding many conceptual topics. And each one of those things that goes into a writer into their story becomes a part of that living, breathing work. And so when they say that no two stories are alike, that's really true. No two stories are alike because the people who are writing them give it their own flair. One of the podcast topics that I don't have organized at the moment, but I would like to do, is one that specifically deals with our most cherished fairy tales. And why do we continue to tell these fairy tales over and over again? Why is Disney so incredibly powerful in that right? I'm not talking about all the other stuff that Disney does. I'm just talking about the fairy tale. And ki- how do we create out of that a purpose maybe for a modern day fairy tale? How do we learn from what has been written before to understand what the basic want and desire of the people that read fairy tales is? I really think that that could be a very interesting topic. The the other one that I do want to talk about, although I have to say that I hate them, is Aesop's fables. Um, I'm not a fan of Aesop's fables, but I feel like it's really important to hear how all of these intricate story little pieces get put together. If you can say that, Aesop's fables either do something for you or don't, but the one thing that I think everybody can agree on is that in a very short paragraph or two, he gets across an entire morality structure. And there's a lot of independent religious texts that take volumes and volumes to get there. And so, how does that happen? And what kind of codification of language are we looking at in order to evoke some of those responses in us? One of the other things that I definitely want to talk about this season is how the First Peoples, how Native American culture created ongoing story that is absolutely fascinating and 100% interesting in its own right. It exists in a plane that is kind of different from the way that we in the West tell stories. And I mean, it's hard. Obviously, the differentiation is kind of odd, but Western storytelling it really kind of comes from a European model. And so when we look at how we are telling story, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at how did the Europeans tell story and what has been handed down to us. So that's sort of the English way of telling stories. But there's plenty of places around the world where storytelling has different formats, where storytelling has different where all the aspects of storytelling sort of fit in different compartments. And I'm hoping that during the course of this podcast, over time, we can explore as many of those ideas as possible because they're all interesting, they're all relevant, and they all carry something with us. They all carry something to us, they reside within us. Um, I also really want to talk a bit about some influential storytellers. And when I say influential, I don't mean that either their works were, subjectively good or subjectively bad. I just want to talk about the influence of them. Um, you know, George Orwell had an influence. Tolstoy had an influence. Um, Steinbeck had an influence. Charles Dickens had an influence. And each one of these influences has a slightly different sort of legacy footprint that it's left on us as storytellers and how we decide which stories to tell and how. And I feel like sometimes we can be a little bit disingenuous to the storytellers that kind of not just came before us, but the different types of stories that we were telling, because we all want to feel like we are telling a unique story. And I think that there's a way to do that and still honor what we have as legacy information. And the last thing that I definitely want to talk about on this podcast is how we, again, codified language, why we use certain words in certain places. And I realize that this might sound a little bit, out of the storytelling range, but it's not. When we choose to use specific language to describe or create environments in world building or just in sort of passive understanding, we give our readers a very broad and yet very specific information piece. So, describing one thing with a certain emphasis in your words on either being very simplistic or very complicated gives the reader a clue about either who the person is that's speaking about this or what it is that you want them to pay attention to. And conceptually, some of these ideas, uh, they are a bit lost in the noise of being a good storyteller. Language is exceptionally important. And I'll, point out, I'm the first one sometimes to point out that, there have been plenty of very commercially successful stories that have really poor limits on how they use language and why certain language or why certain descriptions become not just cringeworthy, but really not the proper way to express what it is that the author usually is saying that they want to express. So that's another aspect. I think the overall and most important part of this podcast as it goes forward will be the power of what our stories are, the power of we as storytellers over the story, and the power of readers as they become more and more engaged in story. Your readers can subjectively choose to see one thing in your story, and even if that isn't what you write, the open interpretation of art is such that they can see that. And that's why it is so important to recognize that tropes exist. And sometimes we write things well, not maybe not subconsciously, but we write things without having a conscious hand in creating them the way that we think we're just doing one thing and we're actually creating a whole different animal. All of these things are really important. I really do actually at one point, I'll write this down. I do really at one point want to talk about why it is so important for authors to understand that once you set your work free into the world, it becomes no different than any other subjective art. Just because we use language to describe, or just because we're using language as our methodology for creating that art, does not mean that it is not still 1,000% subjective in the hands of the person who is interpreting that art. And so for us, that would be the reader. Um, Art by itself only exists when someone can appreciate it. That is really important. So as we're looking at, what do we think makes good story and how do story elements all come together, and some ideas about mixing and matching different pieces and aspects of storytelling together, why you may want to consider understanding them before you write them, because it has an impact on what your readers will think. And I've seen this happen quite a bit over the past 10 or 15 years. And it's interesting. We have social media, we have all kinds of direct lines where people are sharing information, sharing ideas about what they thought a book was about or how it was told. And there's lots of varying opinions on different pieces of literature, of books in general. And sometimes people agree and sometimes people don't. But how do we as authors try to position ourselves so that what we're putting out there has the best possible impact on, or the closest to what we were envisioning, on our readers? How do we get our readers to really understand what it was that we were saying instead of having it be sort of open to all of these other interpretations that maybe we weren't expecting? Sometimes that really does boil down to good storytelling. So I'm going to keep this really short for the first episode. It's just an overview of where we are going to go with our further episodes. As I said, next week on our true inaugural run. We are going to talk about the hero's journey. We're going to talk about Joseph Campbell. We're going to talk a little bit, not just about the mythic cycle, but we're going to talk about why each aspect of the hero's journey matters and how you can have stories that incorporate a single aspect or all of them, and which pieces sort of fit where. Um, we'll talk about how Disney used the hero's journey as almost a template guideline. We'll talk about how we're moving into a slightly different understanding of what the hero's journey is by mixing up our acts with, different rises and fall in action, where we place them. At some point, and I don't know if it'll be in the hero's journey, but we'll definitely talk about how story beats matter in the hero's journey. What Where we place our story beats really does matter. And if your hero's journey has story beats at different times, your actual hero's journey may end up being, it may feel different. It may not feel the way that a lot of other stories feel, and maybe that's a good thing. um, so I hope that you'll join me. I hope that you will send me some ideas. If you would like to explore a topic, if you would like to let me know that you agree, disagree, would like to give me some homework to do, I'm here for it. I can be reached at any time through moviesandmeals.com. You can also send me a message through Wadco Media, and, let me know what you're thinking. What kinds of things would you like to talk about on the Storyteller Power Hour? I am absolutely willing to explore just about anything related to story. So, I'm really excited about this. Like I said, I'm your host, Jen. You can, again, one other quick, just, bit of housekeeping, I guess. One of the things that I am the most interested in is getting people's opinions on the trope dynamic of what we're going to be talking about. And this, I think, is maybe more important than anything else because we live in a world of tropes right now. So if we're talking about the hero's journey, let's talk about The Last of Us. If we're talking about children's books, let's talk about Wednesday on Netflix. If we're talking about the damsel in distress, let's find a movie where the damsel in distress idea gets turned upside down, or that we, subvert that whole thing. And let's really get into different ideas based on our own pop culture, that because it becomes relevant for the storyteller to see these in real world applications. So I hope you'll join me. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. We'll see you next week at the same time. And I hope you'll join me also for our tomorrow podcast on 10 to 1, when we'll be talking about movies that have cars as either the central character, the plot device, or just generally about cars. I think it's going to be fun. This particular 10 to 1 has some real interesting pieces that can go along with it. So I'm super excited. Josh and I host that together. It'll be super exciting. Um, I think I'll see you next week. Okay.